It was late afternoon when Thomas pulled his old pickup into the driveway, the same one he'd built with his own 2 hands 40 years ago. Dust swirled behind him as the engine went quiet. The air smelled like cedar and rain. He'd just come from visiting his wife's grave, a quiet hour that always left him both heavy and calm. He wanted to do something simple afterward, something grounding. Fix the wobbly chair she used to sit in. For that, he needed his tools. He walked into the workshop, expecting the familiar scent of oil and sawdust. The place had always been his second heartbeat. Every mark on the bench, every nailed jar on the shelf told a story. But today something felt off. The air was too still, the light too clean. He reached for the cabinet handle, the one that used to creak a little when he opened it. The door swung wide. Inside, nothing. Empty shelves stared back at him. No hammers, no chisels, not even the old measuring tape that still had a piece of his wife's handwriting on it. For a second, he thought maybe Ethan, his son, had moved things around. Then he saw it, the outline of dust where the wooden toolbox used to be, the faint rectangular shadow on the workbench like a ghost of what once belonged there. His throat tightened. 40 years of work, 40 years of sweat and memory, gone without a trace. He turned around just as Clara appeared in the doorway, a soft smile on her face, holding a cup of coffee like it was any other afternoon. "Oh, Dad," she said lightly, brushing her hair back. "We sold all that old stuff. You don't need tools anymore. You're retired." The words hung in the air like a crack in wood. Thomas didn't move. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "You sold them. Of course, they were just collecting dust. Ethan and I thought it was time to clear things out." She took a sip of her coffee, completely at ease. "Besides, we could use the space. Maybe turn it into a little studio for me." He looked at her, not angry yet, just hollow. The workshop around them suddenly didn't feel like his anymore. The sun from the window hit the dust motes, swirling in slow motion, catching in his breath. "I see," he said finally, nodding. "You're right, Clara, I don't need them anymore." She smiled, relieved that he wasn't making a fuss. "I'm glad you understand. Change is good, Dad. You've done enough work for a lifetime." Thomas stepped closer to the bench, running his hand across the bare wood where his hammer once lay. His fingers found a small groove carved into it, the letter T, burned into the grain years ago. He let his thumb rest there a moment longer. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried something new, steel under the softness. "You're right," he said slowly, his eyes still on the groove. "I've done enough work." He turned to face her. The smile had left her face now. "But you," he continued, steady and low, "you're going to need a lawyer." The silence that followed was heavy. Clara blinked, the color draining from her face. She laughed nervously. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Thomas didn't answer. He just looked around the empty workshop, his workshop, and exhaled. Years of patience had taught him not to raise his voice. Wood doesn't bend by shouting. It bends by knowing where to press. He picked up a small splinter of oak from the floor, the last remnant of what once was his craft, and rolled it between his fingers. "Every nail in this house," he said softly, "I drove myself. Every beam, every hinge, every step you walk on, I built it. You may sell my tools, Clara, but don't ever think you built this life." He set the splinter on the bench and walked out into the fading light, leaving her frozen in the doorway. Outside, the air smelled like the beginning of rain again. Thomas took one last look at the workshop before closing the door. The creak sounded different now, hollow but not defeated. There was work to do, just not the kind Clara would ever understand. He pulled his jacket tighter and walked toward the porch, the first ember of a plan flickering behind his eyes. And if you've ever been told you're too old, too done, or too retired to matter, stick around. Because sometimes the quietest people have the loudest stories to tell. 2 years before that day in the workshop, Thomas's world had already started shrinking. His wife, Mary, had passed quietly in her sleep. Just one cold January morning and the sound of the coffee maker still dripping in the kitchen. After the funeral, the house didn't sound the same anymore. It used to breathe with laughter, footsteps, music from the old radio. Now it was just air and echoes. He still made 2 cups of coffee every morning, one for him, one for her. The second cup always went cold. Most days he sat on the porch, staring at the empty wooden chair next to him, the one he'd built for her when they first moved in. He'd run his hand across the worn armrest where she used to tap her fingers to the rhythm of his stories. That chair was more than wood and nails. It was proof that love could be built and held together, until it wasn't. Then one Sunday, Ethan and Clara pulled up in their shiny SUV, smiling wide, carrying grocery bags and good intentions. Clara stepped out first, her perfume filling the air, bright and sharp. "Dad," she said, her tone gentle but practiced, "you shouldn't be alone in such a big house. It's not good for you." Ethan nodded along, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Thomas smiled, grateful for the visit. He didn't notice the glance they exchanged. "I'm doing all right," he said softly. "The house keeps me busy." Clara reached out, touching his arm. "We've been thinking. Maybe we could move in for a while, help out with the bills, the chores, keep you company." He hesitated. The offer sounded kind, even comforting. "You'd really do that?" he asked, eyes lighting up just a little. "Of course," she said, smiling like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Family should stick together." Thomas laughed, an honest, fragile laugh he hadn't made in months. "Your mother would have loved that," he said. "She always wanted the house full again." That night, for the first time in a long while, the kitchen smelled like home-cooked food. Clara made dinner. Ethan fixed the squeaky window in the hallway, and Thomas sat at the table listening to the sound of plates clinking and people talking. It almost felt like Mary was still there, humming while she stirred her soup. But something small shifted quietly in those first few weeks. It started with the chair. One morning, Thomas came out to the porch, coffee in hand, and froze. The empty chair, Mary's chair, was gone. In its place sat a tall, fake potted plant, its plastic leaves stiff in the breeze. He stepped closer. "Clara?" he called. She came to the door, cheerful as ever. "Oh, that old chair, it was falling apart. I thought I'd make things a little brighter out here. The plant adds color." Thomas looked at the plant, then back at her. "That chair's been here since Mary and I built this porch." "Oh, I didn't realize," she said, shrugging. "Don't worry, Dad, it's still around somewhere. You'll get used to the new look." He nodded slowly, but inside something went cold. The house that once smelled of pine and varnish now smelled like lavender candles and disinfectant. The floors he used to mop with care were always spotless, but they didn't feel like his anymore. Little by little, his things began to vanish. The handmade quilt disappeared from the couch, replaced with a shiny gray throw. His wife's photo on the mantel was moved to the hallway to make space for family pictures. And every time he tried to mention it, Clara's tone turned soft, pitying. "Don't worry, Dad. We're just helping you move forward." Moving forward. Those words started to sound less like comfort and more like a command. Thomas found himself spending longer hours in the backyard, sanding small pieces of wood for no reason at all, just to feel the grain under his fingers, to remember who he was. But even there, he could feel Clara's shadow. "Careful, Dad," she'd call from the kitchen window. "You don't want to hurt yourself." He smiled politely, but the words stung. He wasn't fragile, he wasn't fading. He just needed space to breathe in the life he'd built. At night, he'd sit again on the porch, staring at where the chair used to be. The fake plant sat there, catching the moonlight, perfectly still. That's when he realized something. The house didn't sound right anymore. It didn't hum or creak like it used to. It sounded organized, controlled, too perfect. He whispered to himself, the house used to sound alive. Now it sounds like someone else's plan. Inside, he could hear Clara laughing at something Ethan said. He loved his son, but the sound carried a chill he couldn't shake off. He wondered if Ethan noticed the difference too, or if he'd already learned to stop noticing. Thomas leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The wind carried a faint smell of cedar, like the house was trying to remind him, "You built me. Don't forget who you are." He took a deep breath, holding on to that thought. The fake plant rustled slightly in the breeze, pretending to be real. And for the first time, Thomas felt the quiet wasn't peace, it was warning. At first, it seemed harmless, Clara's little ideas to freshen up the place. She started with the living room, painting the walls a pale gray. "We're just modernizing, Dad," she said, rolling paint with a cheerful hum. "You'll love it once it's done." Thomas smiled, trying to believe her, but as the brush covered the last bit of warm oak paneling, something inside him felt painted over too. The smell of new paint couldn't hide the scent of the past, it just buried it. Next went the dining table, the one he and Mary had eaten at for 35 years. Clara listed it online without telling him. When he came home from the grocery store, it was gone. A sleek glass table sat in its place. "Isn't it gorgeous?" she said. "So much more light, so much more space." He nodded politely, but when he sat down for dinner, the glass felt cold under his palms. The wood had always been warm, like it remembered the meals, the laughter, the small fights that ended with forgiveness. This one remembered nothing. Over time, the house started changing faster than he could keep up. The curtains Mary had sewn were replaced with blinds. The old clock that chimed every hour was too loud and got boxed away. Even the little rug at the foot of the stairs disappeared one morning. When Thomas asked, Clara said, "It was fraying, Dad. I'm saving you from tripping." He wanted to argue, but her tone made him feel silly, like a child refusing to clean his room. Then one afternoon she came into the workshop holding a small stack of papers. "Hey, Dad," she said lightly. "I just need you to sign this so I can pay the property taxes faster. It's just a formality. You know how slow the county is." He wiped his hands on a rag, looked at the papers, and saw a blur of words, legal terms, fine print, things he didn't understand. He hesitated. "Do I need to read all this?" Clara laughed softly. "Oh, don't worry about it. Ethan already looked it over. It's just for efficiency. You trust me, right?" Thomas looked at her, young, confident, the woman his son had chosen, and he wanted to trust her. He always believed family was supposed to mean safety, so he signed. When she left the room, he felt a small pang in his gut, the kind of instinct that comes too late, but he brushed it off. "It's just paperwork," he told himself. "No harm done." In the weeks that followed, more things went missing. His hammer, the one with his initials carved into the handle, vanished from the workbench. He searched for it for hours, turning over drawers, lifting boxes, calling out to Clara if she'd seen it. "Oh, that old hammer," she said from the kitchen. "I sold it at the yard sale. It looked rusty." He froze. "You sold it?" She turned, shrugging. "Dad, it was just a tool. Just a tool." He nodded slowly, pretending not to care. But inside, something hollowed out. That hammer wasn't just metal and wood, it was his life's proof. The first tool he'd ever bought. The one that built his house, fixed the crib, mended the stairs when Mary fell once and laughed it off. Losing it felt like losing his name. That night he sat in his workshop long after everyone had gone to bed. The walls looked bare, stripped of memory. The air was too clean, too quiet. Every time he reached for something, his hand met emptiness. He whispered to himself, "She's taking the house apart one piece at a time." And yet to anyone outside it looked perfect. Neighbors who visited would smile. "You're so lucky, Tom," they'd say. "Your son and daughter-in-law take such good care of you. My kids barely call." He'd smile back, nodding. "Yeah, I'm lucky." But behind that polite grin was a loneliness he couldn't explain. They thought he was being looked after. They didn't see that every favor cost him another piece of his life. The night before Thanksgiving, he walked through the house alone. The pictures on the wall were new, professional portraits of Ethan, Clara, and their 2 kids. His photo with Mary had been moved to the hallway again, almost hidden behind a door frame. He reached out, straightened the frame, and whispered, "Sorry, honey. I should have said something sooner." From the kitchen, he heard Clara laughing on the phone, her voice light and sweet, talking about how much better the place looked now that it's modern. He looked around, realizing he was a stranger in his own home. Every wall, every piece of furniture, every color reflected someone else's taste. His fingerprints had been wiped clean. He turned toward the empty corner where his toolbox once sat. In its place was a woven basket filled with fake flowers. He stared at it for a long time before saying softly, "They've even replaced the dust with plastic." Outside, the porch light flickered against the window, the same light he and Mary had installed together. It trembled for a second, then steadied like a pulse trying to keep rhythm in a body that's fading. Thomas sat down, feeling the weight of silence press against his chest. He wasn't angry yet. He wasn't even sad anymore, just invisible. He didn't know it yet, but the kindness that wrapped itself around him was a trap, tight, polite and smiling. It started small, so small that if you didn't know Thomas, you'd think he was overreacting. One morning he went to grab a few bills from the jar above the fridge. He always kept a little cash there just for small things, a birthday card, a treat for the grandkids, a coffee downtown. But when he reached for it, the jar was empty. He frowned, checking again. "Clara, have you seen the money that was here?" She didn't even look up from her tablet. "Oh, that. I used it to pay the utility bill. Don't worry, I'm handling all the finances now. You don't have to stress about those things anymore." He hesitated. "I wanted to buy something for Sophie's birthday." Clara sighed, smiling in that patient, patronizing way that always made him feel small. "We already got her something from all of us. You don't need to spend extra, Dad. She won't even notice." Thomas looked down, the words caught in his throat. Sophie had always loved the little wooden toys he made her, hand-carved animals painted bright colors. "She'll notice," he said quietly, but Clara was already back on her screen. That weekend, he slipped a $10 bill from his wallet and headed for the garage, planning to sand and varnish a piece of leftover pine. The simple act felt like breathing again until Clara's voice cut through the doorway. "Dad, don't go in there." He turned, startled. "What?" She walked up, hands on her hips. "It's messy, full of sawdust. I just cleaned that side of the house. Please stay out of there. You'll make a mess again." He stared at her, half wanting to laugh. "It's a workshop. It's supposed to be messy." "At your age," she said, shaking her head, "you should rest, not pretend to be a craftsman." The word pretend hit him harder than he expected. Pretend. He'd spent 40 years carving, building, fixing. He'd built the very table she ate from, the door she walked through every morning, the house she called hers. And now he was just pretending. He didn't argue. He just nodded, pretending to agree, and went back to his chair in the living room. He looked down at his hands. The same hands that had once held steady against the vibration of a saw now trembled slightly under the weight of a coffee cup. The veins stood out, the skin thinner than before, but they were still his hands. That night, while the house slept, Thomas got up quietly and walked to the workshop. He stood in the doorway, the air thick with the faint smell of wood and oil that even Clara's cleaning sprays couldn't erase. Moonlight spilled through the small window, landing right where his hammer used to hang. The empty hook glinted in the light like a missing tooth. He walked to the workbench and placed his palm flat against it. The wood was cold. For a long time he didn't move. Then, under his breath, he whispered, "I built this house, every inch of it, and now I'm told I don't belong here." The truth stung, but it was also freeing. For months he'd been shrinking, accepting her tone, her rules, her way of helping. But standing there in the silence of the workshop, he remembered who he was. He was not a man who needed permission to exist in his own home. The thought steadied him. He took a slow breath and looked around. The cabinets were empty, but the walls still remembered him. Every nail, every joint, every scratch carried his fingerprint. Clara could throw away his tools, but not the part of him that built. He whispered again, "You can take the tools from my hands, but not the work from my soul." The words weren't loud, but they settled deep inside him like a spark catching dry wood. From that night on, Thomas changed. He spoke less, listened more, observed. He stopped arguing when Clara updated something. He stopped reacting when she moved his things. Instead, he started paying attention to her habits, her words, her timing, when she paid bills, when she checked the mail, when she whispered to Ethan about taking care of things. She thought his silence meant surrender, but silence to Thomas had always been part of the craft. The woodworker's pause the moment before the next cut. And in that quiet, something was forming, not anger, not revenge, but a decision. He didn't know what it would look like yet. He just knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let the house he built become the place where he disappeared. The day Thomas finally picked up the phone to call Henry Cole, he'd already spent the morning staring at the empty shelves in his workshop. The light slanted across the dust, catching the outlines of things that used to be there. He didn't know what he wanted to say, only that the silence had gotten too loud. When Henry answered, his voice was warm and steady, the same voice Thomas had trusted for 40 years. "Tom, you sound like hell. What's going on?" Thomas exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "Henry, my tools are gone. My accounts are empty, and my own son doesn't even see it." There was a pause on the other end. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "Clara sold them," Thomas said, his tone flat. "She said I didn't need them anymore. Then I started noticing my debit card not working, bills being paid I never saw, money just gone." Henry didn't interrupt. He let the words sit heavy, the way only old friends can. Finally, he said quietly, "Tom, that's not bad luck, that's theft." Thomas swallowed hard. "She's family, Henry. I keep thinking maybe I'm overreacting." "No," Henry said, his voice firm now. "You're not. This is what we call financial elder abuse. It happens more than people realize. They start small, helping with bills, moving things around. Next thing you know, your name's off your own house." Thomas rubbed his temple, the words sinking in. "So what do I do?" "You fight smart," Henry said. Not loud, not yet, quietly. That word quietly hit home. Thomas wasn't a man of noise, never had been. He built his whole life out of patience and precision. Quietly, he repeated almost to himself. "I'll help you," Henry continued. "We'll need to gather everything, bank statements, deeds, any papers she's had you sign, emails, messages, whatever you've got. Don't confront her, not yet. Let her think you're still the sweet old man she's got wrapped around her finger." Thomas almost smiled. "I can do that." Henry chuckled. "Oh, I know you can. You used to outsmart contractors twice your size without saying a word. This won't be much different." For the first time in months, Thomas felt something flicker inside him, control. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was focus. Over the next few weeks, he followed Henry's advice. While Clara thought he was napping, Thomas was reading through old files. When she left for errands, he copied account numbers, wrote down dates, even kept a small notebook hidden behind the furnace. Henry stopped by on Wednesdays, always with a thermos of black coffee and a folder tucked under his arm. They'd sit out back by the old oak tree, talking in low voices while Clara was at her yoga class. "Got the latest statements?" Henry asked one morning. Thomas nodded, handing over a small envelope. "She's been withdrawing cash every few days, says it's for groceries, but the totals don't make sense." Henry flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "She's bleeding you, Tom, slowly enough so you don't notice until it's too late. Smart, but not smart enough." Thomas gave a quiet smile. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." Sometimes their conversations drifted off topic. Stories about their wives, old fishing trips, that time they almost set a boat on fire trying to fix the motor. It felt good, like remembering a language he hadn't spoken in years. "You know," Henry said once, sipping his coffee, "you were always the calm one, never raised your voice even when things went wrong." Thomas looked toward the house. "Doesn't feel like that calm did me much good lately." "Don't mistake quiet for weak," Henry said, his tone softening. "The strong ones are the ones who can stand in the storm and not move." Later that day, Thomas went into town to the flea market. Rows of tables stretched under the sun, old tools, rusted lamps, jars of forgotten screws. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, but then he saw it. A hammer. Not new, not shiny. The handle was cracked, the head dented, the kind of tool that had seen decades of work. He picked it up and felt the weight settle into his palm like it belonged there. "How much?" he asked the vendor. $5, the man said. "Bit old-fashioned, but solid steel, still got some life left." Thomas turned it over in his hand. "Yeah," he said quietly, "still got some life left." He bought it and took it home, setting it on his workbench where the old one used to hang. The light from the window hit it just right, and for a moment he could almost hear the sound of nails being driven into wood again. He didn't use it, not yet, just left it there, gleaming softly in the half-light. That evening, Henry called. "You good, Tom?" Thomas looked at the hammer, the reflection catching in his tired eyes. "Yeah," he said, "better than I've been in a while." "Good," Henry said, "because when the time comes, we'll make sure she never sees it coming." Thomas smiled to himself, a quiet, steady smile. "Don't worry," he said, "the hammer will fall when the time is right." The night of his 69th birthday didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a show he hadn't been invited to. Clara had spent the whole week planning a lovely dinner, ordering catering, hiring a photographer, decorating the house with string lights that glowed a little too bright. But when Thomas came downstairs, wearing his cleanest flannel shirt and holding a small card he'd written for his granddaughter, he realized something strange. There was no seat for him at the main table. He stood there for a moment, looking around. Laughter filled the room, glasses clinked, music played softly from the Bluetooth speaker. The dining table was full, Ethan at one end, Clara in the middle, surrounded by her friends from her yoga group and a couple of business partners. "Hey," Thomas said quietly, trying to smile, "do you need me to grab another chair?" Clara turned, startled like she hadn't expected him to speak. "Oh, Dad. No, don't worry about it. We didn't want you to feel overwhelmed. You can sit on the porch if you want, it's quieter out there. We'll bring you a plate." Her words landed soft, but the sting was sharp. "On the porch," he repeated. "Just for a bit," she said, flashing that polished hostess smile. "You'll be more comfortable." Ethan said nothing. He avoided his father's eyes, pretending to focus on pouring wine. So Thomas nodded. "Sure," he said. "The porch sounds fine." He stepped outside into the cool night air. The music and laughter spilled through the windows, muffled by the glass. The porch light flickered, casting a warm, uneven glow over the wooden boards. He sat down slowly, the old chair creaking beneath him, the only thing left in the house that still felt like his. From where he sat, he could see the reflection of the party in the glass door. Clara was radiant, laughing, touching Ethan's shoulder, talking fast and loud like she was hosting something important, and then he heard it. One of Clara's friends leaned close and asked, "So what happens when he, Clara smiled, lowering her voice, but not enough. "Once he's in the care home, this place will finally be ours. Ethan's already talking to a realtor." Thomas froze, the world seemed to go still. Care home. The words echoed in his mind, hollow and cold. He turned his gaze toward Ethan, just hoping to see some sign of protest. But his son only nodded, his face tired, resigned. He didn't even look up. Thomas sat back slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. Inside, the room erupted with laughter again, glasses toasting, the kind of cheer that used to mean family but now just sounded like noise. He reached for the small paper bag he'd brought with him earlier, the one from the flea market. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, was the hammer he'd bought weeks ago. He held it in his lap, the metal cold against his palm. His thumb brushed the worn handle, tracing the small cracks like reading a familiar story. Through the window, he could see Clara making a toast. Her voice carried clear and sweet. "To family," she said. Thomas almost laughed, a dry, quiet sound that wasn't joy or bitterness, just disbelief. "To family," he whispered. He looked down at the hammer again. In its weight, he felt something steady, something that belonged only to him. Inside, Clara's laughter rose again, bright and hollow. The sound pressed against the glass like a storm he couldn't stop. He turned his gaze toward the night sky. The porch light flickered once more, then steadied, casting a faint glow over the photograph on the side table, Mary's picture in a simple wooden frame. Her eyes, kind and calm, seemed to look right through the noise. He picked it up and smiled sadly. "They built walls around me, Mary," he murmured. "Time to build a door." For a moment, the wind brushed through the yard, soft but sure. He could almost hear her laugh again, the one that used to fill this same porch when they built it together. Thomas leaned back in the chair, the hammer resting across his knees, the photo in his hand. Behind the window, the party went on, music, chatter, the world moving without him. But out here in the quiet, something was shifting. He didn't know what his next step would be yet. But he knew this. He wasn't going to fade away quietly. He looked once more at the hammer, its metal glinting in the light, and felt a calm resolve settle in his chest. "They think I'm finished," he whispered. "But they've forgotten who built the foundation." Inside, the laughter swelled again. Outside, Thomas sat still, waiting, not broken, not angry, just ready. 2 days after the birthday dinner, Thomas sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed. The lights were dim, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock Clara had bought, the one that never quite matched the rhythm of the home. He stared at the phone in his hand for a long time before finally dialing a number he hadn't called in months. When the line picked up, he heard a familiar voice, warm but cautious. "Dad, hey, Liv." His voice cracked a little. "You busy?" She paused, then said gently, "You never call this late. What's wrong?" He swallowed hard. It's about the house, about Clara. I think I made a mistake." There was silence on the line, the kind that carries more emotion than words. Then, "Tell me everything." He did, slowly, carefully, as if saying it out loud might make it all too real. The empty workshop, the missing money, the care home conversation, every small humiliation he'd swallowed just to keep the peace. When he finished, Olivia's voice trembled with quiet anger. "She did all that to you, and Ethan, he just let it happen." Thomas exhaled. "He's not the same kid I raised. He's tired, Liv. I think she's got him believing this is for the best." "Not anymore," Olivia said. "I'm coming home." He tried to protest. "You've got work, your kids," but she cut him off. "You built this family, Dad. It's time someone helped you rebuild it." The next evening, a car pulled up the driveway just as the sun dipped low. Olivia stepped out, suitcase in hand, her expression firm but kind. When she saw him standing by the porch, she hugged him tighter than she had in years. "You look smaller," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "The walls got closer, that's all." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one Clara rarely used except for her laptop. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Henry Cole walked in, hat in hand, his face serious. "Well," he said, looking between them, "looks like we've got ourselves a team." Olivia nodded. "Let's fix this." Henry spread a few papers across the table, bank statements, property records, photocopies. "First thing," he said, "we move whatever money's left out of joint accounts. Clara can't steal what she can't reach." Olivia took notes, her pen moving fast. "I can set up a transfer. I'll make sure she doesn't see it." "Second," Henry continued, "we confirm the house. Legally, it's still yours, Tom. She's been acting like she owns it, but the deed says otherwise." Thomas rubbed his chin. "She's clever, Henry. Always 2 steps ahead." Henry smiled. "Then we'll be 3. He flipped another document forward. "We'll also need a doctor's statement, something that proves you're of sound mind. Clara's probably already spreading the idea that you're losing it. We'll shut that door before she can open it." Olivia leaned back, arms crossed. "She's been telling people he's forgetful. Even Aunt June said something." Henry nodded. "Exactly what I expected. Once we have that certificate, her whole story falls apart." For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt something that wasn't fear. It was clarity, purpose. The same quiet steadiness he felt when cutting wood, measure twice, cut once. He looked at Henry. "So what's next?" Henry's eyes softened. "We keep quiet, you act the same as always. She needs to believe nothing's changed." Thomas smiled, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "That's one thing I'm good at." Henry chuckled. "A good builder doesn't shout when he works. He measures, then acts." The words landed deep, like a line drawn straight across the soul. Over the next week, they moved carefully. Olivia met with the bank manager under the pretense of updating family records. Henry arranged for the doctor's visit, someone trustworthy, an old friend who remembered Thomas well. When the doctor asked routine questions, name, date, memory checks, Thomas answered each one with calm precision. At the end, the doctor smiled. "Mr. Reed, you're sharper than most of my staff." That night, Thomas sat in his workshop again. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dust, though most of the tools were gone. The hammer sat on the workbench, gleaming faintly under the bulb. He picked it up, feeling the weight, the balance, the promise of it. Then he smiled. Clara passed by the door, phone in hand, barely noticing him. "Don't forget your vitamins, Dad," she called out sweetly. "Sure thing," he said, slipping the hammer back onto the bench. She didn't notice the look in his eyes. When she was gone, Olivia stepped quietly into the doorway. "You okay?" He nodded. "Better than okay." She smiled. "Feels different, doesn't it, having someone on your side again?" He looked around the room, the walls, the workbench, the empty hooks that once held his life's work, and exhaled. "For the first time in a while," he said softly, "I don't feel alone." Outside, the evening wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Inside, under the dim workshop light, a father, a daughter, and an old friend sat around a table of plans, not for building a house this time, but for rebuilding justice. Thomas looked at both of them and said, "Let's make sure this place remembers who really built it." The morning of the reckoning felt different. The house was too quiet, too still, like it knew something was coming. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched, the hammer resting beside him on the wood. Sunlight poured through the blinds in narrow stripes, slicing the silence into pieces. At exactly 10, Henry arrived. He wasn't wearing his usual easy smile today. In his hand was a leather folder thick with papers. Behind him came Olivia, carrying her laptop and that look she'd inherited from her mother, the one that said she was done being quiet. A few minutes later, Clara walked in, perfectly put together as always. Her perfume hit the air before her voice did. "What's all this?" she asked, glancing at the papers. "Are we having another family meeting?" Thomas looked up, calm, almost kind. "Yes," he said, "we are." Ethan followed her in, shoulders tight, face pale. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Henry cleared his throat. "Please have a seat." Clara laughed lightly, waving a hand. "Oh, Henry, you always make things sound so official. What's this about exactly?" Henry didn't answer right away. He opened the folder, spreading out bank statements, printouts, and a small black recorder. "We've been reviewing some irregularities, Clara. Withdrawals, transfers, money missing from Thomas's accounts." Her smile faltered just slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Olivia leaned forward. "We do, and we have proof." Clara blinked, feigning confusion. "Proof? That's ridiculous. Everything I've done was to help this family, to help him." Thomas finally spoke, his voice low and even. "You helped yourself." Clara turned toward him, her tone sharp now. "That's not fair, Dad. You're remembering things wrong." "Ethan, tell him." But Ethan didn't move. He just stared at the table, silent. Henry reached for the recorder and pressed play. The room filled with Clara's voice, her real one, stripped of sweetness. "Once he's gone, we'll sell it for 600,000. Ethan, this place will finally be ours." The sound hung in the air like a knife suspended in silence. No one spoke. The laughter, the chatter, the fake warmth, all gone. Only the hum of the refrigerator and Clara's shallow breathing filled the space. Her face went white. That's not me. You're twisting things." Henry slid the document forward. "You signed the transfer papers, you made the withdrawals, and you lied." Clara stood up abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "You think you can trap me with this? You've all turned against me." Thomas rose slowly, steady, unshaken. He placed his hand on the hammer, just resting it there, not lifting it. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but carried through the room like the sound of wood splitting clean. "Return every dollar," he said quietly, "and get out of my house or face court." Clara froze, her mouth open but no words coming out. Tears welled, more from panic than remorse. "Thomas, please, I didn't mean." "You did," he said, meeting her eyes. "You just didn't think I'd notice." Henry slid another paper across the table, legal agreement, already prepared. "Sign this," he said. "You'll transfer everything back and release any claim to the property. In exchange, no charges." Clara looked around desperately, at Olivia's cold stare, Henry's silence, Ethan's hollow eyes, and realized there was no way out. Her hand trembled as she took the pen. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was the only thing in the room for a long moment. When she finished, she pushed it back toward Henry, her fingers shaking. Ethan looked up finally, tears pooling in his eyes. "Clara," he whispered. But she just grabbed her purse, her dignity falling apart piece by piece. "You'll regret this," she said weakly, her voice cracking. Thomas didn't respond. He only stepped aside, letting her walk past him. As she opened the front door, sunlight spilled across the floor, sharp and clear. She paused for a moment as if hoping someone would stop her. No one did. When the door closed behind her, the silence that followed was deep and clean, like a wound finally stitched shut. Ethan sat down, covering his face with his hands. "Dad, I didn't see it. I swear I didn't see what she was doing. I thought she was helping." Thomas looked at him for a long time, then reached across the table and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Seeing comes slow, son, but it comes." Ethan's voice cracked. I'm sorry, I know. Henry gathered the papers quietly, sliding them back into his folder. It's done, he said softly. No need for shouting, justice doesn't need noise. Thomas nodded, then looked down at the hammer. It sat there in the center of the table, its handle smooth under the light. He didn't lift it, didn't need to. The victory wasn't in the strike, it was in restraint. He reached out, gently set the hammer upright, and said almost to himself, "Work's done." No one spoke after that, they didn't need to. Outside, the wind rustled through the old oak, and his house breathed again. The house was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't the kind of quiet that hurt. It was the kind that lets you breathe. After Clara left, the place felt lighter, like someone had opened a window after years of stale air. Her perfume faded from the curtains, her voice no longer cut through the rooms. What remained was something simple, steady. The sound of footsteps that didn't rush, the smell of coffee brewing just for two. Ethan stayed. He filed for divorce quietly, without drama or blame. "I made my choices," he told his father. "Now I need to make them right." Thomas didn't say much. He'd learned that real forgiveness doesn't come from speeches. It comes from showing up. Every morning they worked side by side in the workshop. At first, Ethan just watched, awkward with the tools, his hands too soft for the kind of work his father did for decades. But Thomas was patient. He guided his son the way he once taught him as a boy, wordlessly at times, just a nod here, correction there. One afternoon, Thomas pulled a faded blueprint from a drawer. "Recognize this?" he asked, sliding it across the table. Ethan squinted, then smiled faintly. "The old porch chair. The one your mother and I used to sit in," Thomas said. "Thought maybe we could build another." They spent days on it, cutting, sanding, fitting joints. Every sound of the saw and every scent of cedar filled the room with something more than memory. It was healing disguised as work. When the final piece slid into place, the chair stood solid and beautiful, but not perfect. The wood carried little scars from the tools, just like the hands that made it. That evening they carried it out to the porch. The sun was sinking behind the trees, throwing long lines of light across the floorboards. Dust danced in the air, catching the glow like golden snow. Ethan sat down first, testing it. "It feels strong," he said, a little surprised. Thomas smiled. "It's not about the wood," he said. "It's about how it's held together." Olivia arrived later that night, dropping by unannounced as she often did now. She stepped onto the porch, saw the new chair, and her face softened. "You rebuilt it?" she asked. "Yeah," Ethan said, glancing at his father. "Well, he did most of it." Thomas chuckled. "He learned fast." Olivia reached out, running her fingers along the smooth armrest. "Dad," she said quietly, "you didn't just rebuild the chair, you rebuilt yourself." Thomas looked out toward the horizon where the last of the sunlight kissed the tops of the trees. For a long time he didn't answer. Then in that same gentle, grounded voice he said, "Maybe, or maybe I just remembered who I was." They sat there together, the three of them, as the evening turned to dusk. No music, no noise, just the steady rhythm of the wind through the leaves and the creak of the porch beneath their feet. When the first stars began to appear, Thomas stood and walked back inside. The workshop was cleaner now, restored to its old order. He picked up a small key from the table, the one to his tool cabinet, and locked it carefully. Then he hung the key on the wall, right beside the window where the light always hit in the morning. "The tools are safe now," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. From outside, he could hear Ethan laughing softly with Olivia, the kind of laughter that had been missing for too long. For the first time in years, the sound didn't echo, it filled the house. Thomas turned off the light and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of cedar and new beginnings. He sat in the new chair, leaned back, and closed his eyes. The wood creaked gently beneath him, just like the old one used to when Mary was still there. He looked up at the night sky, whispered, "It's done, Mary. The house is home again." The wind moved through the yard like an answer. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas Reed smiled, not because something had been won, but because something had finally been restored. 6 months passed, and the house didn't just feel alive again, it sounded alive. Hammers tapping, saws humming, laughter echoing from the old workshop that had once fallen silent. The space that used to hold Thomas's loneliness now held something new, purpose. Ethan had helped him rebuild everything from the ground up. They replaced the cracked windows, sanded the floors, fixed the lighting. The workshop looked different, but it still carried the soul of the man who built it. One morning, Ethan stood in the doorway holding a fresh sign carved from oak. The words were simple but strong, "Woodcraft for Widowers." Thomas read it, smiled, and said, "That's a mouthful." Ethan grinned. "It's honest. You're teaching men like you how to work with their hands again, how to remember who they are." And that's exactly what he did. Every Saturday morning, a handful of men showed up, some old, some not so old, all carrying the same quiet sadness. They were teachers, plumbers, accountants, husbands who had outlived their wives and lost their sense of purpose somewhere along the way. Thomas greeted each one with the same calm warmth. "No experience needed," he'd say, handing them sandpaper or a chisel. "Just a willingness to learn and two hands that still want to make something." At first, they were clumsy, cutting wood unevenly, dropping nails, laughing at themselves when the measurements didn't line up. But slowly, under Thomas's steady guidance, they started to change. He'd walk around the room, helping with a grip, adjusting a plane, telling stories about Mary and the house they built together. "You know," he'd say with a half smile, "wood's a lot like people. You can sand it, stain it, polish it, but it's the imperfections that make it real." The men listened, and something in their eyes softened. One day, a man named George, quiet, gray-haired, a retired postman, held up the birdhouse he'd made and said, "My wife always wanted one of these. I think she'd like this." Thomas looked at him and nodded. "Then she will." That afternoon, when the class ended and everyone had gone, Thomas stood alone in the workshop, the late sunlight spilling through the window. Dust floated in the air like gold. He looked around at the benches, the tools, the laughter still hanging in the walls, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. His hands were rough, lined with age and work, but steady. He wiped them on a rag, then picked up his hammer, the same one that had followed him through every chapter of his life. He ran a thumb across the metal head, polished it clean, and smiled. "They said I was done working," he murmured, setting it back on the hook. But some work never ends, the work of building dignity. He walked to the switch, paused for a moment, and looked back one last time. The workshop glowed softly in the fading light, warm and alive. Then he turned off the lights. Morning came early, as it always did. The first rays of dawn slipped through the window, lighting up the hammer on the wall. The same beam of sunlight touched Thomas's hands as he poured his coffee, steady and calm. In the quiet of the morning, his voice lingered like a whisper, a truth earned through years of loss and rebuilding. "You can sell my tools, but never my hands. You can take my money, but never my worth." The screen would fade slowly to black, the soft sound of wind through the trees behind his house. And then a voice, calm, sure, carrying the message he'd lived to prove. "If you've ever been silenced or underestimated, remember, your hands still build, your heart still matters." Subscribe for more stories that remind us dignity never retires.